Richard sat on the couch, staring at his laptop screen. The words blurred together as his mind wandered. The clock on the wall ticked rhythmically, the only sound in the quiet room. He typed aimlessly, trying to finish a report that was due the next day. It was just another evening, or so he thought. Deborah walked into the room, her footsteps soft on the carpet. She paused in the doorway, watching him. He sensed her presence, but didn't look up until she spoke. "Babe, I'm pregnant." Richard's fingers froze above the keyboard. The words hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers. Deborah was standing there, her hands resting on her stomach, her expression unreadable. A small, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips, but there was something else there too, something that made his gut twist. Pregnant. The words stumbled out of his mouth, disbelief coloring his tone. They hadn't been intimate in what felt like forever. The distance between them had grown wide, a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. He tried to remember the last time they had been together like that, but his mind came up blank. How is that possible? Deborah's smile widened, but it wasn't a smile that brought comfort. It was cold, almost mocking. She took a step closer, her eyes gleaming with something dark. "I got some help?" she said, her voice low and deliberate. Richard blinked, confusion clouding his thoughts. "Help!" The word felt foreign, like it didn't belong in this conversation. He tried to understand, but nothing made sense. "From your best friend," Deborah continued, her tone casual, as if she were discussing the weather. Richard's heart skipped a beat. His best friend? Jerry? The man he had trusted with everything, the one person who had always been there for him? His mind raced, trying to connect the dots, but the pieces didn't fit. It was like a bad dream, one where nothing made sense no matter how hard you tried to wake up. "You're joking," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wanted to believe it was some sick joke, that she was testing him for reasons he couldn't fathom. "I'm not joking, Richard." Deborah's voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. "Jerry's Big Johnson worked wonders. And now, I'm carrying his child." Richard felt the floor drop out from under him. The room spun, and he had to grip the edge of the couch to steady himself. His best friend had betrayed him. The man he had considered a brother had slept with his wife, and now she was pregnant with his child. The reality of it hit him like a freight train, and he struggled to breathe. Deborah wasn't done. "But don't worry," she said, her tone turning icy. "Jerry doesn't want anything to do with this baby. He's too scared of what his wife will say if she finds out. So, you're going to raise it as your own." Richard stared at her, his mind reeling. She was serious, deadly serious. She was telling him that he was expected to raise the child of her affair, the child of the man who had stabbed him in the back. "You can't say no," Deborah added, her eyes narrowing. "If you try, I will destroy everything. I'll take everything from you, and you'll be left with nothing. You're a loser, Richard, and I can ruin you in ways you can't even imagine." The threat was clear, but it wasn't the fear of losing everything that gripped Richard. It was the sheer audacity of it all, the betrayal, the manipulation, the cold-hearted cruelty in her words. Rage began to bubble up inside him, a white-hot fury that threatened to consume him. But he couldn't let it out. Not now. He forced himself to stay calm, to think rationally. He couldn't afford to react impulsively, not when so much was at stake. He had to be smart, to play the long game. This wasn't the time to lash out. He needed to survive this moment. And then, when the time was right, he would make them both pay. Richard took a deep breath, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Of course," he said, nodding slowly. "I'll do whatever you want." Deborah studied him for a moment, as if searching for any sign of resistance. But Richard kept his expression neutral, hiding the storm that raged inside. Finally, she seemed satisfied. "Good," she said, her voice softening just a bit. "You'd better not disappoint me." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence returned. But it was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, filled with the weight of what had just happened. As soon as she was gone, Richard's calm facade crumbled. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white as the reality of the situation sank in. The woman he had loved, the woman he had vowed to spend his life with, had betrayed him in the worst way possible. And his best friend, the man he had trusted above all others, had been a part of it. But Richard wasn't going to let them win. He wouldn't let them ruin him. They thought they had the upper hand, but they had no idea what he was capable of when pushed to the edge. He would pretend to be the perfect husband, the doting father-to-be, until the time was right. Then he would strike back, and he would make sure that when he did, they would both be left with nothing. Richard leaned back on the couch, his mind racing as he began to formulate his plan. This would be his most elaborate, most devastating act of revenge. And when it was over, they would know just how dangerous a man with nothing left to lose could be. The weeks that followed were a carefully orchestrated performance, with Richard as the lead actor. Every morning, he woke up next to Deborah, the woman who had shattered his trust, and he smiled as if nothing had changed. He played his role with precision, leaving no room for suspicion. "Richard, do you think this color is good for the nursery?" Deborah asked one afternoon, holding up a swatch of pale blue paint. Richard glanced at it, nodding thoughtfully. "It's perfect," he said, his voice warm. "The baby will love it." Deborah beamed, pleased with his response. She turned back to the paint samples, oblivious to the cold calculation behind his eyes. Richard watched her, his mind racing through the steps of his plan. He needed her to feel secure, to believe that he had accepted his new reality without question. They went shopping for baby clothes the next weekend. Deborah browsed through racks of tiny outfits, holding up a little onesie with a smile. "Isn't this adorable?" Richard chuckled, playing his part to perfection. "It's cute. Let's get it." Deborah added it to the pile in the shopping cart, her attention completely focused on the task at hand. Richard pushed the cart beside her, nodding at her choices, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Every act of kindness, every gesture of affection, was a piece of the mask he wore, hiding the storm brewing within him. At night, Richard lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while Deborah slept soundly beside him. The sound of her steady breathing grated on his nerves, a constant reminder of her betrayal. But he didn't let his anger show. He knew he had to be patient. His time would come. The tension in his chest grew each day, but he kept it in check, focusing on the endgame. Deborah had no idea that the man she thought she had manipulated was silently plotting her downfall. One evening, after a particularly long day of playing the doting husband, Richard received a text from Jerry. Asterisk, "Up for a drink?" Asterisk, Richard stared at the message for a moment before replying. Asterisk, "Sure, meet you at the usual spot." Asterisk, when he arrived at the bar, Jerry was already there, sitting at a high table with a beer in hand. Richard walked over, clapping him on the back as he sat down. "Good to see you, man." "You too," Jerry said, smiling. "How's everything going with Deborah?" Richard ordered a drink, keeping his expression neutral. "She's doing great. We're both getting ready for the baby." "That's awesome," Jerry said, lifting his glass. "You must be excited." Richard picked up his own glass, forcing a smile as he clinked it against Jerry's. "Yeah, really excited." The lie slipped out effortlessly, but beneath the surface, his mind churned with resentment. He wanted to grab Jerry by the collar, to demand an explanation, but he knew it wasn't time yet. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, playing the part of the carefree friend. As they continued to talk, Richard carefully steered the conversation away from anything that might give him away. He listened as Jerry talked about work, about sports, about everything except the one thing that mattered most. Richard responded when necessary, nodding and laughing at the right moments, but inside, he seethed. When Jerry excused himself to use the restroom, Richard's eyes followed him as he walked away. Alone at the table, Richard took a slow sip of his drink, his grip tightening around the glass. Jerry had no idea that the man he considered his closest friend was waiting for the right moment to destroy him. Jerry returned, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath Richard's calm exterior. "So, you ready to be a dad?" he asked, resuming his seat. Richard's smile was tight. "As ready as I'll ever be." Jerry grinned. "You'll be great at it. Just wait until you hold your baby for the first time. It's life-changing." Richard nodded, though the words stung. The child wasn't his, and he knew it. But he kept his composure, pretending to share in Jerry's enthusiasm. The irony wasn't lost on him. Jerry was congratulating him on becoming a father, blissfully unaware of the truth. As the evening wore on, Jerry grew more relaxed, the alcohol loosening his tongue. Richard listened, waiting for any slip, any hint of guilt, but Jerry remained oblivious. He was confident, unguarded, completely unaware of the storm brewing right beside him. When they finally left the bar, Richard felt a surge of anger that he had to bury deep inside. Jerry clapped him on the back, a brotherly gesture that only fueled Richard's resolve. "Take care, Richard. And hey, if you need any advice, you know where to find me." Richard nodded, forcing a smile. "Thanks, Jerry. I'll keep that in mind." As Jerry walked away, Richard watched him go, his mind already working through the next steps. He had played his role perfectly, and neither Deborah nor Jerry suspected a thing. They believed they were in control, that they had won. But Richard knew better. He was the one pulling the strings, and when the time was right, he would make his move. The mask of deception was firmly in place, and Richard intended to wear it until the very end. They had underestimated him, but they wouldn't see what was coming until it was too late. The days had slipped by, bringing Deborah closer to her due date, and Richard's plan was nearly complete. He had worked late into the night, carefully gathering every piece of evidence he needed. A folder on his laptop contained recorded conversations, incriminating text messages, and photos that painted a clear picture of the affair. He had also been quietly siphoning money into a separate account, preparing for the day he would disappear without a trace. But outwardly, Richard was the model husband. He accompanied Deborah to her doctor's appointments, held her hand as they listened to the baby's heartbeat, and even attended childbirth classes. Every smile he offered was calculated, every touch rehearsed. Deborah was none the wiser, convinced that she had Richard exactly where she wanted him. One evening, as they sat down at dinner, Deborah looked at him with a casual expression, though her words were anything but. "I talked to Jerry today," she said, spearing a piece of chicken with her fork. Richard didn't flinch, though his heart skipped a beat. "Oh," he said, his tone carefully neutral. He reached for his glass of water, taking a slow sip as if the conversation held no real interest to him. "Yeah," Deborah continued, a slight smirk on her lips. "As I told you, he's too scared of what his wife will do if she finds out about this." Richard felt a surge of anger, but he buried it deep. He had anticipated this, even counted on it. "Is that so?" he asked, keeping his voice steady as he set down his glass. Deborah shrugged, as if Jerry's decision was of little consequence. "But that's fine," she said, a note of satisfaction creeping into her voice. "You're going to take care of everything, right? You'll raise this baby like it's your own, won't you?" Richard set his fork down, taking a moment to look directly into Deborah's eyes. "Of course," he replied softly. His words were calm, almost reassuring. "I'll take care of everything." Deborah smiled, pleased with his response. She had no idea how much truth lay in those words. Richard watched her for a moment longer, then returned to his meal, his mind already running through the final steps of his plan. The next day, Richard made a visit to the bank during his lunch break. He closed out the joint account he shared with Deborah, transferring the funds into his private one. The teller gave him a polite smile, unaware of the significance of the transaction. Back at work, Richard logged into his email and drafted a message to his lawyer. He had already secured a legal separation and planned to file for divorce the moment Deborah gave birth. The email was short, outlining the steps he wanted to take, ensuring that all the necessary documents would be ready when the time came. With a click, he sent it, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over him. That evening, as he sat in the living room pretending to read a book, Richard overheard Deborah on the phone with one of her friends. She was laughing, discussing baby names and future plans, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. Richard listened quietly, his expression unreadable, but his thoughts were razor-sharp. A few days later, Deborah's parents came to visit, bringing a large gift basket filled with baby supplies. Richard greeted them warmly, playing the role of the excited father-to-be. They sat in the living room, chatting about the nursery and the upcoming birth. Deborah's mother fussed over her daughter, while her father patted Richard on the back, congratulating him on his impending fatherhood. Richard smiled, thanked them for their support, and made all the right comments. Inside, he He was counting down the days, each interaction with Deborah's family only fueling his determination. They, too, were in the dark, unaware of the truth behind the happy facade. The day before Deborah's scheduled doctor's appointment, Richard made one final visit to a storage unit he had rented in a nearby town. Inside were the few personal belongings he intended to take with him when he left. A suitcase with clothes, a box of important documents, and the laptop containing all the evidence. He checked everything one last time, ensuring that nothing was out of place. As he stood in the small, dimly lit unit, Richard allowed himself a moment to reflect. This was it. He had set everything in motion, and soon, the life he had known would be over. He would walk away from Deborah, from the lies and betrayal, leaving nothing behind but a carefully constructed path of destruction. When he returned home that evening, Deborah was sitting on the couch, flipping through a baby magazine. She looked up as he entered, her expression softening. "Tomorrow's the big day," she said, referring to the appointment where they would check the baby's progress. Richard smiled, leaning down to kiss her on the forehead. "I know," he said. "I'm looking forward to it." Deborah returned to her magazine, Content, while Richard headed to the kitchen to prepare dinner. As he chopped vegetables, his mind was focused on what came next. The appointment would be the last time he played the role of the devoted husband. After that, everything would change. Later that night, as Deborah slept, Richard sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wall. His mind was clear, his resolve unshaken. He had done everything he could to ensure that when he walked away, there would be no turning back. Deborah thought she had won, that she had him trapped, but tomorrow, the mask would begin to slip, and she would see just how wrong she was. Richard finally stood, turning off the kitchen light and heading to bed. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of the end, and he was ready. The day Deborah gave birth was a whirlwind of emotions for Richard. Standing in the sterile hospital room, he watched as Deborah labored through the birth of their child, or rather, the child that wasn't his. When the nurse placed the baby in his arms, Richard felt a surge of love for the innocent life before him. The tiny face, the small hands grasping at the air, she was blameless in all of this. But even as he cradled his newborn daughter, the resolve within him hardened. This child would be cared for, but not by him. He had another purpose, one he had meticulously planned for months. Deborah, exhausted and blissfully ignorant of the storm brewing within her husband, smiled weakly at Richard. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" she whispered. Richard nodded, managing a soft smile. "She is," he said, keeping his voice steady. He could feel Deborah watching him, but he didn't allow her to see the conflict within him. The tug of affection for the child and the cold, calculated hatred for the woman who had betrayed him. Over the next few weeks, Richard slipped seamlessly back into his role as the devoted husband and father. He changed diapers, rocked the baby to sleep, and even took over some of the nighttime feeding so that Deborah could rest. Each time he held his daughter, he felt a pang of guilt, but he reminded himself that this was necessary. He couldn't allow the emotional attachment to cloud his judgment. Deborah, preoccupied with the demands of caring for a newborn, didn't notice the subtle shifts in Richard's behavior. She didn't question why he started staying late at work, nor did she suspect anything when he claimed to be catching up on projects he had fallen behind on. In reality, Richard was meeting with his lawyer, finalizing the details of their separation. He had ensured that when the time came, there would be no loose ends. One evening, after Deborah had gone to bed, Richard sat at the kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. He pulled out his phone and composed a message to his lawyer. Asterisk, everything is ready. We proceed tomorrow. Asterisk, he hit send, his heart pounding in his chest. The wheels were now fully in motion. The next day, Richard went through the motions of his routine. He kissed Deborah goodbye before heading to work, just as he always did, and promised to pick up dinner on his way home. But instead of driving to the office, he headed to the storage unit where he had stashed the few belongings he planned to take with him. A suitcase, the laptop with all the evidence, and some cash he had set aside were all waiting for him. After securing his things in the car, Richard made one final stop at the bank to withdraw the remaining funds from the account he had secretly set up months earlier. The teller smiled as she handed him the cash, completely unaware of the significance of the transaction. With everything in place, Richard drove back to the house one last time. The neighborhood was quiet, the sun beginning to set as he pulled into the driveway. He paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the house that had once been his home. It was strange, he thought, how a place could hold so many memories, both good and bad. But this chapter was closing. Inside, the house was silent except for the soft hum of the baby monitor. Deborah was upstairs, resting with the baby after a long day. Richard moved quietly through the kitchen, leaving his keys on the counter. He took out a piece of paper and began to write a note. The words came easily, as if he had rehearsed them in his mind 1,000 times. Deborah, asterisk, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know everything. The affair, the lies, the betrayal. You thought I was weak, that I would bend to your will. But you were wrong. I've left behind everything you'll need to understand just how thoroughly you've lost. The evidence is there, photos, recordings, documents. Don't bother trying to reach me, because I'm done with this life, and I'm done with you. Asterisk, asterisk, you'll be hearing from my lawyers soon. The house, the money, everything, it's gone. You wanted me to raise another man's child as my own, but I refused to live a lie. You made your choices, and now you'll live with the consequences. Asterisk, goodbye, bitch. Richard folded the note and placed it on the kitchen table, along with the folder of evidence he had compiled. He stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision he had just made. It was done. There was no going back now. He walked to the front door, pausing briefly to listen to the soft cooing of the baby coming from the monitor. A small part of him wanted to say goodbye, to hold his daughter one last time. But he pushed the thought away. This was the only way. If he lingered, if he allowed himself to feel anything more, he might lose his resolve. Richard stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind him. The evening air was cool, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves in the trees. He walked his car, got in, and drove away without looking back. As he turned the corner, leaving the house and his old life behind, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. The weight of betrayal, anger, and pain lifted, replaced by the calm certainty that he had done what was necessary. Richard drove into the night, the road stretching out before him like a path to freedom. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He was free from the lies, free from the betrayal, and free to start anew. Deborah's day started like any other. She woke up, fed the baby, and stumbled downstairs, still groggy from the restless night. As she entered the kitchen, the first thing she noticed was the quiet. Richard wasn't around. Normally, he would have left a note if he had an early meeting, but this time there was nothing. The house felt eerily still, like a void she couldn't quite place. Then, her eyes landed on the folded piece of paper on the kitchen table. A chill ran down her spine. She recognized Richard's handwriting on the outside, her name scrawled in neat letters. With trembling hands, she picked it up and unfolded it. As she read the note, Deborah's world began to collapse around her. Richard knew. He knew everything. The affair, the lies, the manipulation she had so confidently wielded over him. Every word on the page was a knife to her heart. He wasn't the weak, pliable husband she had thought him to be. He had been planning this, biding his time, and now he was gone, leaving her with nothing. Her first instinct was to call him, to beg him to come back. She fumbled for her phone, dialing his number with shaking fingers. The phone rang, echoing in the quiet kitchen, but there was no answer. She tried again and again, but each call went to voicemail. Her frantic messages were filled with desperation, but she knew deep down that they would go unanswered. Richard had cut her off completely. Panic surged through her. She had to do something, anything to fix this. She needed help. Deborah hesitated for only a moment before calling Jerry, her lover, the man who had promised her everything would be okay. As the phone rang, she pictured his face, the confident smile that had drawn her in, the promises he had made. "Jerry, it's me," she said as soon as he picked up. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What do you want, Deborah?" His voice was cold, devoid of the warmth she had grown accustomed to. "Richard found out," she blurted, her voice breaking. "He knows everything, and he's gone. I don't know what to do. I need you." Jerry sighed heavily. "I can't help you, Deborah. My marriage is over because of you. My wife left me, and she's taking the kids. My life is ruined, and it's your fault. Deborah's heart sank. But, Jerry, we were in this together. You said, I said a lot of things, he interrupted, his tone harsh. But I'm done. I've lost everything, and I'm not about to lose any more because of you. Tears welled up in Deborah's eyes as she realized the full extent of what had happened. Jerry wasn't going to save her. He wasn't going to be there for her like he had promised. He was cutting her off, just like Richard had. Please, Jerry, she whispered, but the line went dead before she could say anything more. She stared at the phone, her hand trembling, before letting it fall to the floor. She was alone, completely and utterly alone. The next few days were a blur for Deborah. She tried reaching out to friends, but word of her betrayal had spread quickly. No one wanted to be associated with her. The whispers and cold stares she received at the grocery store only confirmed what she feared most. She had become a pariah. The baby's cries pulled her out of her thoughts, and she realized with a start that she had been sitting on the couch for hours, staring blankly at the wall. The reality of her situation crashed over her in waves. She was a single mother, abandoned by her husband, rejected by her lover, and shunned by her community. Deborah moved through the days in a fog, mechanically going through the motions of caring for her child, but the weight of her situation was crushing. She had lost her home, her status, her safety net. The life she had known, the life she had taken for granted, was gone. All that remained was the suffocating loneliness and the haunting realization that she had brought this upon herself. She sent more messages to Richard, begging for forgiveness, asking him to come back, but each one went unanswered. His silence was a constant reminder of how thoroughly she had underestimated him. The man she had once thought weak had orchestrated her downfall with chilling precision. The evidence he had left behind ensured that she couldn't contest the divorce, and her pleas for custody were likely to fall on deaf ears. Richard had made sure of that. Meanwhile, Richard's life had taken on a new sense of purpose. Free from the toxic marriage, he felt as if a great weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He had moved to a new city, started a new job, and began the process of rebuilding his life from the ground up. There were no regrets, no second thoughts. His revenge had been cold and calculated, and it had been devastating. He ignored every call, every text from Deborah. To him, she was nothing more than a distant memory, a chapter of his life that he had closed for good. The guilt he might have felt was overshadowed by the knowledge that he had reclaimed his life. The betrayal had nearly destroyed him, but in the end, it had given him the strength to take control of his future. As the days turned into weeks, and then into months, Deborah's life continued to spiral downward. The money she had left was dwindling, and the walls seemed to close in around her with each passing day. Jerry had moved on. Richard was unreachable, and the friends she once had were nowhere to be found. She was trapped in the prison of her own making, with no way out. Richard, on the other hand, found peace in his new life. The past was behind him, and as he looked toward the future, he knew one thing for certain. Never again would he allow anyone to have that kind of power over him. Richard's new life was supposed to be a fresh start. He had carefully orchestrated his departure, severing all ties with the past, and relocated to a quiet town where no one knew his name. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. He found a new job that kept him busy, rented a small but comfortable apartment, and even began to socialize with new people. But despite his best efforts, the satisfaction from his revenge slowly turned into something else, something he hadn't anticipated. At first, the sense of victory lingered. Richard would wake up each morning, remembering the look of desperation on Deborah's face when she realized what he had done. It was a reminder that he had taken control of his life, that he had been the one to strike back. But as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, that satisfaction began to fade, replaced by an unsettling sense of emptiness. The guilt started creeping in during the quiet moments. He would be sitting alone in his apartment, the noise from the city outside barely audible when thoughts of the child, asterisk her asterisk child, would surface. Richard had never seen himself as a father, and certainly not as a father to another man's child. But he couldn't shake the image of the innocent baby he had once held in his arms. He told himself it wasn't his responsibility, that the child was a product of Deborah's betrayal, not his. But the guilt gnawed at him, slowly eroding the sense of justice he had once felt so strongly. One evening, while eating dinner alone, Richard's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Richard. The voice on the other end was soft, hesitant. His heart skipped a beat. Who is this? It's Deborah. There was a long silence. Richard felt his anger rise, but it was tempered by something else. Curiosity, maybe, or the unresolved guilt that had been haunting him. What do you want, Deborah? I just wanted to hear your voice, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know how to say this, but I'm struggling, Richard. Everything's falling apart. He could hear the exhaustion in her voice, but he stayed silent, unwilling to offer any comfort. I'm raising her alone, Deborah continued, her words spilling out in a rush. I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you. But I'm lost, Richard. I don't know what to do. Richard clenched his jaw. That's not my problem anymore, Deborah. I know, she whispered, her voice breaking. But you don't understand. Things are happening, strange things. I think someone's watching me. Richard frowned. What are you talking about? There are noises at night, she said. Things moving in the house when I'm alone. And sometimes I get these messages like someone's trying to tell me something, but I don't know who. Maybe it's your guilt, Richard snapped, tired of the conversation. You brought this on yourself, Deborah. You wanted to play games, and now you're paying the price. But what if it's not just me? Deborah's voice was desperate. What if it's happening to you too? Richard was about to dismiss her paranoia when he remembered the strange occurrences in his own life. The items in his apartment that weren't where he'd left them, the anonymous messages he had received, cryptic, threatening notes slipped under his door. He had written them off as harmless pranks, but now a cold chill crept down his spine. What do you mean? He asked more seriously this time. Richard, I know you don't owe me anything, but please meet with me. Just one time. I need to talk to you in person. Against his better judgment, Richard agreed. There was a part of him that needed to know if Deborah was just losing her mind or if something more sinister was at play. They met in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Deborah looked like a ghost of her former self. Pale, with dark circles under her eyes, her once polished appearance now disheveled. She sat across from Richard, her hands trembling as she gripped her coffee cup. I'm sorry, she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. For everything. Richard didn't respond, his gaze fixed on her, waiting for her to continue. I know you don't want to hear this, but I'm scared, Deborah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I could handle it, everything that's happened, but now I feel like I'm being watched all the time. And it's not just me, Richard. It's happening to you too, isn't it? Richard didn't want to admit it, but he nodded slightly. I think it's Jerry, Deborah said, her voice trembling. He blames us for everything that happened to him, and now I think he's trying to get back at us. Jerry disappeared, Richard replied, his voice cold. He's got no reason to come after us now. But what if he does? Deborah pressed. What if he's been planning this, just like you planned your revenge on me? Richard leaned back in his chair, considering her words. The idea seemed far-fetched, but there was something about the way she said it that made him uneasy. Look, Deborah said, her voice cracking. I know you don't care about me anymore, but if there's even a chance that Jerry is behind this, we need to find out. For our own safety. Richard hesitated. He wanted to walk away, to leave Deborah to deal with her own mess. But the strange occurrences in his own life, the feeling of being watched, nagged at him. If Jerry was indeed behind it, he couldn't just ignore it. Fine, Richard said finally. We'll figure this out. But don't think for a second that this changes anything between us. Deborah nodded, relief washing over her face. Thank you, Richard. I just want this to end. As they left the cafe, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He scanned the streets, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the unease lingered, gnawing at him as he walked away. Back in his apartment that night, Richard couldn't sleep. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. He knew that whatever was happening, it wasn't over. The fallout from his revenge had taken on a life of its own, and now it seemed to be spiraling out of control. Richard had thought he was done with the past, but the past wasn't done with him. And as the shadows crept across his room, he realized that the real nightmare was just beginning.